as we dive further into Zen in a Mess. And I'm going to do something a little unusual tonight. I'll invite you, if any questions arise for you as this hour unfolds, you can write them in the chat. I'm not guaranteeing I'll get to them. I might get to them tomorrow, or I might just get back to you personally. But put them in the chat. We'll see where this goes. So, one of the things that characterizes a mess, or a lot of the wicked problems we face today, we lean into, we find ourselves in the thick of, is that it doesn't solve. It doesn't solve easily. You can't just think your way to a solution, lay it out, plan the work, and here it comes. It doesn't work that way. How do we solve the racism in our country? How do we solve climate change? How do we solve the deterioration of our democracy? But that doesn't mean that we're hopeless or helpless. It's still possible to live with wisdom, with love, with compassion, even in the middle of a mess. And how we meet this matters. And there's a way of being in a mess without being a mess. And even if we're the mess, there's a way to work with it. All of which I feel deeply our training shows us. Again and again, it shows us. If the mess is here, if the mess is me, increasingly, I can see through it. You can see through it. The mind that doesn't stop. The body that's not sticky or stuck, but rather is more open through breath, through energy, so that things drop through. We can have that body. Sometimes in difficult conditions, we can start to work with our triggers or notice when we're triggered. Even as I gave the litany of problems facing our society right now, I can feel little triggers firing in here. It's painful. And I am the impulse. If I watch this stuff right before I go to bed, I don't sleep so well. So, and yet, if I ignore it, ignoring can lead to suffering, both for myself and others. I can get out of step with what's going on. It doesn't mean I have to indulge it 24/7. We live in we've got a 24/7 of opinions. And every opinion shouted out to another. And we tend to try to find those opinions we agree with. But we're also ignoring another side of the story. Maybe a side that we find painful. If we start putting up and resistance, It creates tension in the body. To hold up shields creates tension. I know, as we work with our physicians, sometimes they're taught or told that to be difficult people, they have to protect themselves and put up shields. And yet when they put up shields, they suffocate on the inside of them. It gets transactional. Some tick mark, box ticking activity on an electronic data record instead of human interaction. If we put up shields, the tension of that doesn't feel like a ball on fast moving waters. It doesn't feel agile. It feels clunky, resistive. And yet taking it all in and not getting triggered and not getting stuck and not getting bad night's sleep takes a kind of, it takes our training. We might call right mindfulness, right? It takes a way to handle this and let it drop through. I love the work, Jeff, that you have done to identify how we can carry, showing pictures of people who carry a weight in gravity so that it just drops through the body rather than carrying a burden that slumps us over and we're heavy and weighted down. So a mess can be, on the one hand, if we approach it like a problem to be solved, it can be exhausting because a lot of messes don't fix. And yet, if we take it as a time of learning and growth, of construction and deconstruction, of how do I, almost like you could take discomfort in Zazen as a teacher, say like any pain is pain in the legs, so that comes with the territory. But anything higher than that is a teacher because it's telling us something's not aligned. And likewise, we can take messes and how they land in us as something of a teacher. What has to be free has to be worked so that we can meet this moment. I can meet this moment with love and compassion, moment after moment after moment. And in this regard, I think one of the useful tools we have in Zen training, or useful way to work with a mess, is koan training. Koan training is at least in my own experience of it, you don't solve a koan by looking at it. It's not solved analytically. We know that. We always say in koan training, don't come in with an explanation, right? Show me something. Embody something. In other words, become the koan. Become something in that koan. We say that this training is about resolving life and death. The Suzuki Shozan would say, this talked about death being his koan. How to absorb that condition, or absorb the truth of that in our beingness. You might think that, well, life and death, I don't have to really worry about that until the last day. I'm not on my deathbed, so I don't really have to worry about that koan right now. But not so. In some ways, it surfaces every day. It surfaces in the messes we face right now. Subtle. It's subtle. You know, so many fears relate to the fear of death. So many fears that we operate with, when you really boil it down, relate to a survival instinct. Like a fear of, I'm not lovable, or I don't fit group, or I don't belong. What's, you know, peel that down. What happened on the savannah if you didn't fit in the group? If you were thrown out, what happened? We're eaten. Or what happens if you put your head up above the crowd and you get it cut off? You know, that kind of history or trauma or whatever is embedded. It's embedded in us. And we might not be able to name it or talk about it consciously, but it's in there. And so we're cautious, or we're guarded, or we try to be safe, or we try to play it this way or that way. And we don't realize lurking under there is some kind of self that's clinging to itself. But it's a life and death struggle. The grip on life runs deep. I remember being blown away by a story Tanoi Roshi told years and years ago. This is probably back in the 80s. It was a time when shoulder harnesses weren't invented yet, seatbelts were often not worn, and traffic fatalities were very common. Very common. And in fact, the passenger seat in the car used to be called the death seat. We don't call it that anymore, but maybe some of you are old enough, like me, to remember when it used to be called that. Yeah? The death seat. And the conventional wisdom of the time was sort of like, well, you know, the death seat, the passenger gets killed most often in the car because, you know, the steering wheel protects the driver. That's not true. As Tanoi Roshi points out, any impact strong enough to kill somebody is a steering wheel is not going to protect you. No. The passenger more often died because the driver made the last decision. I thought when I heard that story, could I be so selfish? Could I be so selfish that I'd take someone else's life to save my own? We don't think of that. We don't think that's what we do. But this stuff runs deep. Another story, a different story from Tanoi that speaks to the resolution of this. It's actually one that Handa Roshi told me, where they were sitting together. They were teachers together. And I think Handa Roshi was relatively new to to the job, and he had heard by reputation of this guy Tanoi, who had the 7th degree black belt in 4 different arts and blah, 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 blah. And Handa Roshi, if you know him, he would kind of describe himself at that time as kind of like a punk. You know, he didn't take anything at face value. And he sits down next to Tanoy and he goes, hey, I hear you've got all these, these degrees and this and that art. What would you do if someone came up to you with a gun? And he's thinking in his mind, if this guy goes into, well, I take the arm and I turn it this way and flip him here, he'd go, bullshit. But that's not at all what Tanoy said. He said, fortunately, my training has taught me how to die. It was so disarming to Hondo Roshi that he started training with Tanoy, right? It was so disarming. But to have the kind of peace that moves beyond the questions of life and death. And even the things that I identifies with, to let go of any of them can feel like a little death. And this is, again, what can make it hard to be in a mess. Because maybe I identify with being a certain political party. So if my party is struggling, I struggle. And I can't let go of that. Or I can't see through that. Or maybe I identify with being worthless. And you'd think I'd be really happy to let go of being worthless. But not so. If I has gotten used to being worthless, to even let go of being worthless feels like a death. And it'll hang on to I suck if that's what it needs to do to feel, well, still alive. It's weird, but we do that. We do that with the things that are our strongest traits and the things that are our self-limiting behaviors or our worst enemies or our upper limits. I identifies with all of them. And it feels like a little death to let it go. So a training that is about resolving life and death can start penetrating all of that. In koan training, there's a kind of paradox at work, because in the one sense, it's about your life and death. And in another sense, there's a system of koans, as I imagine you know, a system of koans that tries to demark certain kinds of milestones along the journey. That there's something universal about the path that we are traversing. And then there's something particular and differentiated in terms of how you'll traverse it or what comes up in your life. What are your sticking points? What are my sticking points? But these different demarcations or these different milestones have been articulated different ways. But one of the systems that has made the most, is clearest to me, comes out of what's called Go-E, the 5 stages, Go-E, the 5 stages of koan training. And in the first stage, we're feeling into or becoming the truth of form is emptiness. In the first stage, we're feeling into what's called this universal principle. We say it every day, we recite it every day in the Heart Sutra, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. We've read it in the Buddhist texts. How do we become it? That's koan training becomes absorptive training, not analytical training, not scholarly training. It becomes, how do I put it in the bones? How do I breathe it? How can I feel that universal nature in all things? And then in the second stage, we flip it around and feel into emptiness as form. How emptiness manifests in a million forms. How can you experience that? In your body. And then in the third stage, you put them together. How can you come from a place where both of these truths express through you? How can you come from a place where the one and the many are embodied in you, a combination of this freedom and action? In the fourth stage, it's called arriving in the storm. Arriving in the storm. Being in a storm and yet able to live with this love, this compassion, this wisdom. Because of what's been put in you, through you. It's not said right, not what's been put in you. I mean, more like what's fallen away, right? Holding that's fallen away. Arriving in the storm. Arriving at some integration with the conditions of a mess. And the fifth stage is settling in to the storm. Settling into the storm. Absolute freedom in the storm. Act, not act. And notice in these stages, it's not arriving to a pleasant day or settling in to fun and games. No, because it's always a storm. Not just the times we chose to live in, although these are particularly stormy, particularly dicey, but it's always a storm. And we can arrive to it and we can settle into it. So as we engage koan training with our entire being, we're increasingly becoming these different koans. You know, one of the best pieces of advice, and those of you who know me know how often I use this one, because I use it all the time. But one of the best pieces of advice from Tanoi Roshi I'd ever heard had been become the other, go from there. His way of working with influence and negotiation and become the other, go from there. It wasn't even try to empathize with another person and go from there. Forget the try. It wasn't even just empathize with another person. He'd go straight to the heart of it. Just become the person. Well, if we can become a koan, if we can become the other, if we can become a mess, if we can keep shape-shifting this way, what do you think it does to our sense of I? What would it do for your sense of I? If you are stuck in an I, becoming these other things is impossible. But the more you move, it's almost like loosening up the steering wheel so it starts to turn freely. Become this, become this, become this, until, right? There's a feeling of shape-shifting, a softening of boundaries, where we could start to see through the constellation of conditions that make up even this life, this life, this life, this life, this life. I say a constellation of conditions, not solid stuff. No essential existence, a constellation of conditions. You think about the constellations in the sky. About the Big Dipper for a moment. The Big Dipper. Does the Big Dipper actually exist? No. No, it's what, 6 or 7 stars that from a certain perspective, a certain angle, I can connect the dots and imagine an image and give it a name, put it in the culture, and we say the Big Dipper, and you all know what I'm talking about. But there's no there there. Do you understand what I'm saying? You couldn't go into outer space and find the Big Dipper. You couldn't go into inner space and find the Big Dipper. It doesn't actually exist. And the same's true of us. And we were not more than 6 or 7 dots, but it's the same thing, a constellation of conditions. But that's what we start to see through as we shapeshift by become this, become this, become this, become this. So when you're working, a koan like Mu, we say become Mu. If you're working a koan with Joshu, become Joshu. Become the bell, become the shit stick, become the this, become the that, become the this, become the, what's happening? You start to feel and see. Through. So become the mess. Become climate change. Become the heating up Earth. When we become something, what it means is we're taking it into ourselves, and as Rebecca said on the first night, letting it change us. We're letting it affect what's going on in this system. We're taking in this energy. We haven't shielded up. We haven't deflected. Instead, we've let it in. So it means now we're engaging that energy in some creative way that is creating maps in our nervous system and all. You could give it names like that, but it's changing us. It's changing us. I am the white supremacy culture. When I quit deflecting that and bring that in, what do I have to see in here? What do I have to look at in here that I hadn't been looking at? What do I have to own that I had been cut off from? That's what this becoming starts to show us. Our shadow side, if you will. What I was ignoring and therefore adding to suffering. Because ignorance, as we know, leads to suffering. So how, in not ignoring anymore, can I start to work with it? When Gautama Buddha awoken from his deep samadhi and looks up at the star and says, I am that. Same thing, of becoming, a sense of no separation. And it feels very nice to be a star, doesn't it? That's nice, and that sounds like mystical. But I'm also this sick society. I'm also the sick people in the sick society. How do I take that in and work with it? Well, I was encouraged recently, um, and it was stimulated by Krishna Roshi was teaching from the Vimalakirti Sutra in our priest training. The Vimalakirti Sutra is one that is very old, and so it's full of flowery language and uh, lots and lots and lots of examples of things. So it becomes kind of hard to read. And I think the first few times I read it, it didn't sink in that much. But somehow, reading it again after Krishna Roshi had been teaching from it, it really hit me because it says in here, it basically it said, maybe because it was also happening in 2020, a mess is a time of learning, growing, and becoming. A mess is where you want to be. It's when you can do your best work, when the most change is possible, when the conditions are most potent and ripe for shifting, where you can most settle fears, where love is most needed. You want to be in a mess. That was a message I really got from the sutra. And how did I get that? There's a line in there attributed to Buddha in the sutra where he goes like, I can't work with empty space. I can't work with empty space to help people. So I have to use some means to help people. I have to use means in our ordinary world. Because you can't help people by just empty space. So we need props. We need some props. And he goes on to give an example. And the example he gets into is of going into the samadhi state. And there's a line in there about how he presses his big toes into the earth. You hear how much I keep emphasizing the big toes when we do our warm-ups in the morning, because it's one of the ways very conducive to opening up into samadhi. So in this that samadhi state where the sense of boundary in the self disappears. I am the whole picture. You are the whole picture. This sense of expansion, no thought. So in the Vimalakirti Sutra, he goes into an example of how he says, I press my big toes into the earth and the world, looks wonderful. The world opens into the bliss of samadhi. And then he goes on to say, you don't see it that way because you're not in samadhi. So what you see is a mess, but I'm in samadhi. Looks pretty good. Okay, when I come out of samadhi, it's filthy again. It's a mess again. When I go into samadhi, come out of samadhi, it's a mess. And it's a mess because when I'm out of samadhi, I'm one-sided. I'm in a point of view, looking at the Big Dipper, looking at the problems, looking at the this, looking at the that. I'm one-sided back in relative dimensions, getting whirled around by change. So here's the punchline. This land appears filthy to lead people to salvation. These are the props. These are the props. So what this back and forthness is showing us, the way to say it is, suffering occurs and no one's suffering. There's a conditioned co-arising of all this suffering. Not a thing exists substantially in itself. It's a constellation. How can we use a mess to see through the whole game? Not a thing exists. How can we use the mess to lead people to salvation? Lead ourselves to salvation. Become this, become that, become this. See through it all. So how do we liberate people? How do we liberate ourselves? Again, not in empty space. Another line from the sutra, though I'm paraphrasing here: the seeds of Buddhahood don't sprout in empty space. They sprout in shit. That was a paraphrase. But, or another way that's sometimes talked about is the lotus doesn't grow on the high ground, it grows out of mud and muck. When we're in a mess, people are hungry to find a way out of the mess. When we're in bliss, and drive, the thirst is extinguished, right? It's when we're struggling that there's so much energy to work the struggle. Living beings in the mire of trouble develop the Buddha Dharma. So, bodhisattva, that is, people dedicated to helping other people, take myriad forms to help push people out of the mud. Why did you take your body form, your life, your situation? And it gives countless examples in the sutra of all the different kind of life situations we could take. And you know what I loved about it? Is that every kind of imperfection you could mention was included. In other words, every imperfect way we can be is one of the ways we can help people. There's a point in the sutra where Vimalakirti is asked some question about his relatives. And he answers, my mother is perfect wisdom. My father is expedient means. Okay, so I come from these conditions that are, call them Buddhist essentials. Perfect wisdom, expedient means. And on he goes to every way that a bodhisattva can work to help people, including, and I'll read a bit of it here, or he shows the eon's end with fire destroying heaven and earth, so that those clinging to permanence realize the impermanence of things. Later on, he says, he's always meditating to upset the demons and prevent their mischief, like that thing most rare, a lotus blossoming in a scorching fire. He meditates amidst desire, which is also a thing most rare. These are first-class messes and first-class opportunities for all of us to see through the impermanence of things, to meet each moment by becoming it with the love. And compassion doesn't mean nice soft stuff, it just means one witness. Compassion with that one witness, no separation. So that people in the mire of trouble can find the way. We're seeing right now in this country how things that we thought were so stable and strong, the strong pillars of democracy, right? Kind of modeled like the pillars outside courthouses and, other public buildings. It looks so stable, right? That would be there forever. We're seeing how fragile it is, right? How it depends on a certain kind of energy in the culture. And when that energy is cut, the form won't hold. I don't have any particular forecasting ability for how this is how this will play out. And yet what I'm sure of is that it can show us the impermanence of things, the conditioned co-arising of all of difficulty, and the seeing through it that lets us be free in the form, free in the mess. How do we practice? It's not far away. That practice again and again of dropping breath straight down like a plumb line, right through the hara, right through the knees or big toes into the earth. Again and again. How clear and open can we make that channel? How available, how wide, how big, how deep. And when the mess at the surface is untenable, don't stay at the surface. So, not having seen any questions show up in the chat, I'm going to stop here for the evening, and we will pick it up tomorrow on how a mess shows us the truth of suffering.